Hello everyone, and thank you for your interest in the River Campus Library's Open Education Grant. This grant has been a priority for a group of librarians working on open education initiatives over the past few years. The members of the grant team include librarians from the humanities, social sciences, and STEM. I'll start with a little background for this grant. Open educational resources, or OER, have become widely used as free or low-cost alternatives to textbooks and other course materials, some of which can be incredibly expensive for students to purchase. An OER is any kind of teaching material, including texts, video, audio, images, and interactive content, that can be freely used, revised, and remixed. The adoption of OER creates a more equitable learning environment for students by making course materials more accessible. As we particularly learn from the lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic within higher education, the need for accessible learning materials has become even more apparent when online and hybrid learning has left many students without access to traditional textbooks and other course materials. The use of open pedagogy practices, or OP practices, in the classroom creates opportunities for students to be more engaged and empowered. They have the chance to become active contributors to the creation of learning materials, which can be made openly available to the public or not. The purpose of this grant is to fund and aid in the creation, adaptation, and publication of OER and to support the adoption of open pedagogy practices. Goals for this project include creating a more equitable learning environment by reducing the cost of course materials and increasing online accessibility. Providing library support to instructors who want to create openly licensed course materials by helping locate existing OER content, or advising on licensing through Creative Commons, or identifying appropriate and relevant repositories for your OER. Empowering students as co-creators of course materials through open pedagogy practices. Helping to grow University of Rochester as an active contributor to the open education community. Studies have shown that openly licensed learning materials have equal or better student outcomes with the added benefit of being free or low cost to students. Lastly, we want to celebrate instructors who have adopted OER into their courses through initiatives such as the Zero Cost Heroes campaign that we started during celebratory weeks of open a few semesters ago. We don't have very many eligibility requirements for this grant pilot. We want to ensure that course instructors are included, but also those who do so much to support student learning on River Campus, such as staff in the Learning Center, formerly CETL. So, funded projects must be related to a credit-bearing course, or projects must support student learning on the River Campus. We'll get into the different tracks available for this grant on the next slides, but we are estimating the first two tracks should be implemented within one academic year, and tracks 3 and 4 should be implemented within 2 academic years. Track 1 involves relicensing an existing work into OER and covers up to $200 per project. There are activities that may need to occur for this track, such as investigating Creative Commons licensing and preparing associated files for reuse. An example of a Track 1 project would be taking a series of lessons that you've already used and relicensing them as OER and uploading them into an appropriate OER repository to make them more findable, ultimately benefiting other teachers and learners. Track 2 involves creating videos, modules, and/or adapting an existing OER textbook for your class and covers up to $800 per project. An example of this is adopting an existing open math textbook and adding new problem sets to go along with each chapter. Track 3 involves redesigning a course to include open pedagogy practices and covers up to $1,500 per project. Possible activities for this track are much more varied than the previous tracks and include different ways to include open pedagogy in the classroom, whether it is for a specific assignment or for an entire course. An example of this would be creating an assignment for students where they would be the ones developing lesson plans and activities that deal with local history and traditions. A significant amount of work would need to go into such a project to ensure students are properly scaffolded and prepared for such an assignment. Track 4 involves creating a new OER book or textbook either from scratch, by remixing an existing work, or a combination of both. This covers up to $4,000 per project. An example of this would be developing an anthology of readings useful to your course that pull from open and public domain resources. I'd like to take a moment to go through some of the requirements for this grant. First, projects will need to be openly licensed either through Creative Commons or its equivalent. For Track 3 projects where open pedagogy practices are used, you will need to abide by FERPA, which is something the library can advise you on. CC licenses consist of a combination of different individual licenses. For attribution, commonly known as CC BY, you must give appropriate credit, provide a link to the license, and indicate if changes were made. You may do so in any reasonable manner, but not in any way that suggests the licensor endorses you or your use. For non-commercial, or NC, the material cannot be used for commercial purposes. For share alike, or SA, if you remix, transform, or build upon the material, you must distribute your contributions under the same license as the original. No derivative works, or ND, means that if you remix, transform, or build upon the material, you may not distribute the modified material. Since remixing is a key component of OER, this license is not appropriate for this grant. It is not an OER. On the right are some of the most common combinations of Creative Commons licenses, sorted from most to least free. An RCL librarian is more than happy to help you choose the right one for your project. Beyond open licensing, there are additional requirements and expectations related to the work funded by this grant. Funded work should be deposited into our institutional repository, UR Research, and one additional OER repository. The grant group can help you identify specific repositories where your work may get the most exposure or where the subject matter is most relevant. We also want to ensure materials meet relevant accessibility standards and are easily edited. For example, if your grant is to relicense a video, you'll need to provide files such as MP4, as well as the original PowerPoint that you are using for that presentation. Another requirement of this grant is that your work should be disseminated within the University of Rochester community. RCL has existing venues to highlight such work, such as Zero Cost Heroes. However, you are not limited to opportunities provided through the libraries. To apply for a grant, the best place to start is at our dedicated grant program webpage, https://www.library.rochester.edu/services/open/grant. We will begin accepting applications in early July and will continue to do so on a rolling basis through the summer and even into the academic year, until our funds are fully encumbered. There are 4 main areas of review to consider within the grant rubric, easily found on the grant webpage that I just listed. These major categories and finer subsets will be shared openly so that applicants can see what is expected through the grant process, and the OER working group members will adhere to the same standards as we begin our evaluation of applications. Project ideas will be broken into 3 smaller categories. Novelty. Is this project something new that will add to the existing OER? Need. Similarly, is the OER content that you propose needed and going to fill a gap within your disciplinary area? and student immersion. For the open pedagogy projects in particular, to what extent will your students be involved in the process of content creation? For the clarity of ideas within your grant proposal, the review board will want to clearly understand the goals, plan of attack, and intended impact of your project. If these things are not immediately obvious to your reviewers, there may be some back and forth where we ask further questions to gain a clearer picture. This level of dialogue can be beneficial as we address unanswered questions together, but it can also hold up decisions on awarding the grant funds. Is your project feasible? Meaning, have you estimated an appropriate amount of time and effort to complete your desired end result within the expected timeline? Will you overtax yourself by being too ambitious and in the end abandoning the project? And have you considered the necessary supports to help you get the work done? In these cases, sometimes less is more. OER and OP work can be a growing addiction due to the increased benefits you see within your students and honestly the things you learn about yourself as the teacher. You should be realistic about how much you can do now versus what you can add on later. Finally, to meet some of the key goals of this grant program, we'll be interested and invested in the overall impacts of your project, both on a national level through sharing your OER in repositories, as well as on a local level. How many students have benefited from your OER or OP work economically, socially, educationally? And to what extent did they learn and become immersed in learning the content, as well as tangential 21st century skills like teamwork, leadership, communication, empathy, etc. If you have any questions about this grant opportunity or the application process, a team of librarians is available to help you with ideas, clarify the impact that your project could make, and offer reasonable support through the project proposal phase. Members of the Open Ed grant team can offer informational resources regarding OER, OP, and CC licenses, including past examples and repositories for idea generation, not to mention helping you to avoid duplication of ideas. We can assist in refining your proposal while answering grant-related questions and navigating supports that can either be tapped into through the libraries or the instructor's connections. Finally, as OA, Open Access, and OER can sometimes be confused, we can help you clarify what will be eligible for this particular grant. With or without the Open Ed grant team, your subject librarian can help brainstorm different ideas, assist in scaffolding and adding time parameters to tasks and milestones, and offer scheduled librarian intervention in the classroom where appropriate. A combination of the Open Ed grant team, your subject librarian, and/or our scholarly communication librarian can help navigate the understanding of CC licenses, FERPA, as well as referrals to University Council and more. Here's a brief overview of the grant process for all approved proposals. I'll go into each one of these in a little more detail on the following slides, but I found it helps to see an overview. Payment occurs within 30 days of our submitting a successful proposal to UR Accounts Payable. As mentioned before, we will begin accepting grant applications in early July. There is no official closing date, and subsequent submissions will be reviewed on a rolling basis. Generally, the River Campus Libraries provides a total of $10,000 per year toward this grant program. The amount of projects we fund will be dependent on the types of submissions we receive and which tracks applicants wish to pursue. Several weeks into July, at the very earliest, the first successful applicants will be notified of their award. After this time, rolling submissions will be reviewed within 2 weeks of their submission. Once you've been notified that your project has been funded, you'll be contacted by the grant team to set up a meeting that will include at least one member of the grant team and possibly your subject librarian. Here, we will discuss any questions you may have regarding the grant process. We'll review the application and deliverables that you've identified. We will also ensure that you have access to any additional information you may need for the next step in the grant process, as well as any supports you may need for your project, such as information on Creative Commons licensing, where to find existing OER if you wish to see if any projects similar to yours are already available, or facilitating connections to other departments of the library, such as Digital Scholarship or the iZone. I will reiterate that you are not alone in this, and we can help with any questions you may have. The next step is scoping the project by preparing an implementation plan, then signing the Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU. The MOU will be pretty standard, laying out the roles and responsibilities for the awardees and River Campus libraries as they relate to the grant-funded project. The implementation plan will be included as an addendum in the MOU, and this is where you will identify specific milestones and related timelines for the grant project. Within the implementation plan, we'd also like to know how you plan on assessing the grant-funded project. How will you gauge success of your grant-funded project? What methods will you use to determine student learning outcomes or the impact of the project on the OER community? This section of the implementation plan will be highly variable depending on what your project is and will culminate in a brief report to be shared with RCL. Upon submission, the MOU will be reviewed within 5 business days. You'll be notified if the MOU is approved as is, or if further clarification may be needed for your implementation plan. When it comes to payments, the grant funds will be split in half. You'll receive the first payment within 30 days of MOU approval. You'll receive the second half of payment upon completion and approval of the final assessment report. The timeline for the second payment can vary greatly for these projects. For Track 3 and 4 projects, the second payment may not occur until the following academic year or later, since these projects are more time-intensive and may take longer to plan and implement. Thank you for your time. If you have any additional questions, you can always contact the Open Ed Grant team at rclopenedgrant@library.rochester.edu. You can also join us for the virtual Q&A session we'll be holding if you need any further clarifications on the grant itself or the grant process. Please see specific information on Q&A sessions on our grants webpage as listed previously in this presentation.